Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about marketing chocolate. And are you marketing your chocolate wrong? Before we get into that, I want to remind everybody that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members of The Chocolate Life. And this is the home of The Chocolate Life right now. You can go there, you can catch up with what's going on, and you can also become a member. Click on the green button in the upper right-hand corner. If you're not a member and you're not logged in, it will say join, and you can become a free member. But there are also membership tiers, which are premium tiers, which give you special benefits. And if you join one of those premium tiers, one of those benefits is, in fact, coaching and consulting hours. So you can go do that. Also want to remind everybody who might be watching that you can go into the comments. So it's the live chat on YouTube or the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook, and you can let me know where in the world you're connecting from. You can also ask questions, make comments, and let me know what you're thinking about what's going on. Happy to get that up into everything. Now, for every post, every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I create a post, and here is the post for today's episode. Right here. So I'm going to go and click on here. Here's the post for today's episode. And what I'm going to do, if you want to make it easy to follow along, is I'm going to get rid of the title here, and I'm going to put a little QR code. And if you scan that QR code, you go directly to the page on The Chocolate Life. This is a new feature that they've added into StreamYard, which is a little bit of fun. And with that, let's get started. Are you marketing your chocolate wrong? This episode was inspired by a gentleman by the name of Rory Sutherland. Rory is very, very senior and very, very long time at Ogilvy and Mather in the UK. And he asks some very, very interesting questions. I've been watching his YouTube shorts for as long as I can remember. And I ran across one over the weekend. So this O&M that's here is Ogilvy and Mather, for anybody who's unfamiliar with the world of advertising. But one of the things that inspired me to do this episode was one of the claims that Rory made, which is, does the order of the claims you make for a product matter? It's an interesting question. And he goes and talks about it in this YouTube video short. And the reason why they're embedded this way is so that you can hear the audio. All right. And so if you are watching and you are in the comments and you can't hear the audio, please let me know, because I spent a lot of time putting these in here in a way that would make it possible for you to listen to the audio. Right? But so in the short, which I'm going to play for you, Mr. Sutherland, Rory, proposes the order in which the claims are made can affect consumer purchase behavior. So ask yourself before watching the short. I'm going to start playing it. I'm going to give you a few seconds. This is live, so you can't pause it, but if it's after the fact, you can pause it, right? So which claim order is likely to be more successful? The phrase alcohol-free before the word beer, or the word beer before alcohol-free? So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about that, and let's hear what Rory have to say. And if you're out there watching, please, if you cannot hear the audio, let me know in the comments, right? But because I can hear it in my ear, and I should be sharing the audio of this tab.
The profusion of acceptable non-alcoholic drinks in pubs is the kind of thing which government would have fantasized about from a public health perspective and a motoring safety perspective, okay? And yet it seems to have happened entirely spontaneously without any government encouragement or intervention, unless you maybe include the tax system, which makes them very lucrative.
Yeah.
Okay. But what was interesting, talking to the people at Lucky Saint, they think that a large part of the reason for the success was that everybody before Lucky Saint had sold alcohol-free beer as, it's alcohol-free and it's beer. And they said, this is a great beer. And by the way, it's got no alcohol.
Yeah.
And that they thought that actually the relative framing of how they framed the alcohol-freeness of that beer was decisive in their success.
So that's an interesting question, right? Posed as a part of an anecdotal case study. So Lucky Saint is a beer brand in the UK. It is an alcohol-free beer brand in the UK. And one of the things that Sutherland suggests is that rather than by saying alcohol-free beer, but saying beer that is alcohol-free, right? What you're doing is you are framing things, not just beer, but great beer that is alcohol free, great tasting beer that is alcohol free. You are framing your product in a way that it's much more likely to attract or to change consumer purchase behavior. And so where do we see claims like that in the world of chocolate, right? And so one of the places where you'll see this is that vegan chocolate. So if you say vegan chocolate, if the vegan is first and it's very prominent, what might happen is that you might get people who don't care about being vegan who will look at it and go, oh, vegan chocolate, you know, I don't like things that are vegan generally, and so I'm not going to purchase a vegan chocolate. But if it's great tasting chocolate that happens to be vegan, or it's great tasting chocolate that is sugar-free as opposed to sugar-free chocolate, what you're doing is you're reframing the way people look at your product. And by reframing the way people look at your product, what you're, especially on the packaging, right, when they're looking at it, and in the marketing, if you're doing social media marketing, if you've got stuff on Instagram, you've got stuff, wherever you're doing that, by thinking about the way you order the claims, you're going to change your purchase behavior, right? So chocolate that is sugar-free, chocolate that is allergen-free, right? You want to focus on the fact that it's what Rory suggests, that what you want to do is you want to focus on the fact that this is great tasting chocolate. And for those of you who know anything about the advertising industry, this is something that you could, in fact, A/B test. Right? You could have two different versions of an ad, or some sort of social media, which drove people to a page on your website. And it might be exactly the same page on your website, but what you could do is you could actually test different versions of creative and figure out which version of the creative drove a higher visit rate and then a higher click-through rate and a higher conversion rate, which is what you're looking for. You want people not just to see your ad, but you want people to go and react with your ad. And then once they've reacted with your ad and clicked through to your website, to be able to convert and make a purchase. Right? And something like changing the order in which you make the claims is something that is easily testable in a lot of different ways. And it's probably something you do want to test. And so think about the claims that you're making. Which claims are the most important claims? And are the claims actually more important than the fact that you're selling chocolate? Or is the fact that you're selling chocolate more important than the fact that it just happens to be vegan, or it just happens to be sugar-free, or it just happens to be allergen-free, or it just happens to be fair trade certified, or it just happens to be one of these other things that you've been selling? People are going to look at the claim that you're making, right? If I'm into pub, for example, in this context, and I see something that is alcohol-free, I'm going to ignore it, right? If I'm not specifically looking for alcohol-free beer, all of a sudden it's on the list. But if I'm looking for great tasting beer, right? Oh, that's great. Oh, this one just happens to be also non-alcoholic. It reframes the question. And so, are you marketing your chocolate wrong? You may be. Right? You need to understand who your audience is, what your audience is looking for, and make sure that you're making the claims in a way that doesn't turn off people who might be interested in what you're doing, right? But also signals to your audience that this is what it is that you're offering them. So I don't know if you believe that or not. Do you think this is an interesting idea? Do you think it's something that you might be able to apply to what it is you're doing? Go into the comments. Let me know. Let me know where in the world you're coming from. I'll get the shout out up on screen, and I will get your question up on screen, and comment up on screen, and I'll try to give it an answer. I don't necessarily know that I would agree with this in every particular case. It may make more sense in certain form factors. It may make certain sense in certain contexts. It may make certain sense for certain products. But I think that going through the exercise of going, oh my gosh, am I thinking about this backwards? And giving yourself the opportunity to do this A/B test, right, would be well worth your while. If you're sending out emails to people, right, so you're running a web shop, you're selling product to people, you can do this via email. You can segment your list, and you can send half the list one message and the other half of the list another message, and see which list generates more clicks and generates more sales. easy thing to do, right? Right within the context. Well, many shopping cart systems allow you to do that kind of A/B testing if they're also doing the outbound emails, and then you can follow all the analytics from the clicks and the conversions. And so it probably is worthwhile spending a little bit more on a shopping cart so that it can help you in this work. It's well worth the incremental monthly costs for such a shopping cart to be able to try these tests in order to be able to drive more sales. So really interesting thing. But do you think, right? Would it make more sense to say, hi, I'm making great tasting chocolate that happens to be sugar-free, or am I making sugar-free chocolate, right? When many people are going, I don't like all sugar alternatives, right? Interesting concept. Is it one that you think might work for you? Let me know in the comments. Second one is, are you focusing on the wrong elements in your branding and in your packaging? So the first one we're going to talk about here, the first example that Sutherland talks about is the little foil lid on cans of San Pellegrino.
San Pellegrino is fundamentally just a lemonade, but it looks fancy.
The foil lid, which I think they're bringing back, I hope at my behest.
Has it gone?
They've taken it off some of the cans, almost certainly because of procurement. Tragic. But it was always the case. There's an Italian drink called something, Chinotto, I think it's called, which the cans always had the foil lid. And there is an argument that it's hygienic. If you've got cans with a foil lid on, you can serve them at a wedding. You can serve them at a board meeting. You can serve, you see what I mean? Whereas you wouldn't serve Tango, okay, at your wedding, cans of Tango. But it nonetheless, that foil lid serves a function. It changes the context within which the drink can be displayed and consumed, and indeed the price at which it can be sold.
Is the price of San Pellegrino high?
I think one might say that it probably commands a price premium.
So I think that's enough of that particular point that is being made. So when people think about packaging, right? So the question becomes, all right, am I going to do a box? Am I going to envelope? What kind of paper stock? What kind of printing am I going to do? If I'm going to do embellishing like foiling, what is that going to look like, right? But it turns out that finding an element which is unique, right, which people can connect with, right, which uniquely identifies the product that you're making, might be a place to start, right, in terms of how am I approaching my packaging? Am I giving my packaging a unique kind of look? Is it instantly identifiable? And in the case of the San Pellegrino cans, it's something, and the Chinotto can, it means that, oh, I know that I don't have to wash the lid, and it provides this upscale perception of the product. Now, one place where I could really think that there is an element of this which is not directly associated with the printing of the package. So people might look at the work that, for example, letterpress does, or Dick Taylor does with the really heavily embossed and debossed letterpress printing that they do on their packaging, which is a signal of, just a tactile signal of a premium kind of product. But I might take a look at the way that Sean Eskenazi Chocolate, does their bar packaging. So it's a very, very simple paper slide-in sleeve, right, that has got a bit of twine that wraps around a closure, right? It's instantly recognizable. I know that when Sean started it, the twine that was used for the closure came from used cocoa bags that he had in the factory. But it is instantly instantly recognizable, and that's a good thing. It's easy open, it's easy close, which is another good thing. So it addresses an issue of reusability, which is often a challenge with many forms of chocolate packaging. Once you've opened the package, it's often very difficult to put the chocolate bar back into the package. The one thing I might say is that Sean made a sort of deliberate, sort of downscale a deliberate downscale selection of the paper that is used on the front of paper that is used for the outer wrappers, which you may or may not like. It is consistent with a message which is talks about lower footprint, more sustainability, because they're not using bleached papers and things like that, right? But one of the questions to ask yourself about your packaging, and this is what it is that is brought up in this clip, is there a very simple element, right, that you can use, not expensive, or maybe it is expensive and it's worth it for the upcharge because of the perception, the increase in value associated with the element that you're adding to this. But what does that look for you, right? And it's really important if you're going to be in a retail environment with lots of other products. How do you differentiate what it is that you're doing in a premium kind of way? And this is important, in this day and age when the price of cocoa is very, very high, right? If you want to reduce the amount of cocoa mass and increase other ingredients, but also want to increase perception of value. One of the things we learned from a marketing report was that gold foil or silver foil on the outside of a packaging is a signal of premium, but that's very, very easy to do. And it's not something that you can differentiate yourself and other people if you've got lots of people who are doing gold foil on the front of what they're doing, right? So is there a way to go and do something which is very, very different and instantly recognizable and gives you that kind of premium feel, right? In a very, very interesting way. In putting these things together, right, the goal here is just to get you to start thinking, right? It's get you to start thinking. It's to provide a point of inspiration, a point to take off and go someplace else in your thinking. Not that you would do something like this if you didn't have a product that you were putting into a can, but if, for example, you had a spalmabile, some sort of chocolate spread that you wanted to put in a jar, right? Or if you had some sort of other kind of product that went in something other than a bar wrapper, a box or wrapper, what would it look like to signal this? And so thinking about that differently is the purpose of these posts. The next one is all about
painkillers are more powerful if they're red. Sleeping pills are more effective if they're blue. Painkillers are more effective if you tell people they're expensive. Painkillers are more effective if they're branded. There are loads and loads of contextual effects like this. Food will taste sweeter if it's rounder. When Cadbury's changed the shape of their individual chunks to make the bars more fun, they were bombarded with complaints saying they changed the formulation of their chocolate. They hadn't. If you change the shape of something, you change the taste. It may explain why.
So there's a really interesting perceptual point that is being made here. Many people will talk about how the color of something will influence, and he mentions that in terms of painkillers be more effective if they're one color over another, or if they have writing on them over another. That's very, very interesting. There's a lot of talk about the environment in which you consume a chocolate, that especially if you've got one form of music over another form of music, the listening, the audio environment, the ambient audio environment will change your perception of the taste of what you're doing, which is really, really quite interesting. As a chocolate judge, I will judge pretty much everything in absolute silence. I will have noise canceling headphones on. I'll have my phone in do not disturb. My computer is not going to be making any noises at me. I'm not listening to any kind of music because I don't necessarily know, or I don't want one form of music to influence. If I'm tasting one piece, I don't want it to influence my perception of the flavor of that piece differently than if I'm eating another piece, right? But how does the shape of something affect our perception of taste? If I have something which is rectangular and I change it to square, does that change the way it tastes or the perception of the taste, even if the formula, even if the recipe is exactly the same? And the evidence here is if you were to go from a square or rectangular format to a round format, people would get the perception that the product tasted sweeter. You could, in fact, use that to your benefit in certain products, putting them into round molds, getting them out there. Perhaps it's a lower sugar content. There's another ingredient you've reformulated in such a way, but people will perceive that they are sweeter, even if they are higher cocoa content. It's an interesting idea. What happens? I mean, Taza started off with round pieces. Is that, I mean, other than the fact that nobody else was doing rounds at the time, discs at the time, is that a part of their success? Is that the perception that people have of the flavor of Taza products? Is it different? Is that why the round discs of Mexican chocolate from Abuelita and companies like that, is that one of the reasons? I mean, they're very, very sweet to begin with, but it's part of their sweetness because of the shape. Interesting concept. So when you're thinking about redoing a product or introducing a new product, think not just about the color, right? And how the color has an influence on our perception of value, how putting your brand on something. Well, how would you put a brand on a bonbon? Well, that would be very simple. What you do is, after you bottom the shells in the mold, what you do is you take a transfer sheet and you put the transfer sheet on the bottom, and your name is on the bottom of, and your logo is on the bottom of every single bonbon. That would be a really, really simple thing to do. It's a way to get really, 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 really clean, very shiny bottoms on your bonbons as well. You may think it's a little bit expensive, but the increase in perceived value with your brand on the bottom is amazing. If you have the money and you're working with an enrobing belt, you can get the enrobing belt patterned so that your logo is in fact embossed on the bottom, just running through the enrobing belt. There are lots of ways to go about doing this, but thinking about color, thinking about branding, thinking about the text, the perception. These things are more effective if they're a certain color. They're worth more. You can charge more for them if they're a certain color, right? And the shape that of your product is going to have an influence on the perception of them. So is that one of the reasons, apart from the fact that they're relatively easy to decorate and they're relatively easy to unmold, is that one of the reasons why demi-sphere molds are so popular in bonbons? Because they're in cross section, they're round. When you look at them from the top down, they are circular. That might be an effect on the perception. So if you do have two different bonbon molds, two different shaped bonbon molds, do exactly the same recipe in two different bonbon molds, give them to people and just ask them a simple question: what's the difference between these two things, if there is one? Again, an easy thing to taste, right? You don't, have them decorated exactly the same way. Or you could say, here's the same bonbon and it's colored blue, and here's the same bonbon and it's colored red. Is there any perception of flavor? I mean, of any perception of a difference in a change of flavor? Right? Again, use these ideas as ways to iterate on your product, right? To be able to influence the way people perceive your product, both in terms of value and in terms of taste, by changing things that are easily under your control if you're decorating them, right? So think about the color of the cocoa butter you're using, and think about the spatter pattern that you might be using, or the painting pattern that you might be using, or if you're using transfer sheets, how the transfer sheet is going to affect, how color is going to affect the perception of value. Really worthwhile to consider. And then something that I really hadn't thought to explore is the idea, if you use different shapes of molds, how the perception of flavor might be influenced by the shape of the mold. Again, things that you can do in your workshop relatively easily and very inexpensively to be able to iterate in and hone in on, right? Ways to increase the perceived value of your product without raising the production cost, so that you can charge more, have a higher margin for what it is that you're doing, right? Just worthwhile considering. This next one is about something that it's about focusing. Are you focusing on the right market? Are your messages on the right market. And I think this is a really, really cool concept.
Apple's reverse benchmarking, right? Everybody was concentrating on technological capability of the devices. And Steve said, okay, we need to be up there. But what you've all completely ignored is aesthetics and usability. So we're going to actually basically sort of sub-match you on all the things all you nerds have been competing for, like RAM and processing speed and bullshit like that. We're going to basically knock you out of the park on the aesthetics and the usability. I think the really decisive products there were things like the iMac and actually the iPod. Were the actual game changers. That was the second coming, really.
I mean, the iPod versus, at the time, the Walkman. It just was the sexiest experience ever.
Okay. So in thinking about what it is that Rory has to say here, what I want you to think about is especially if you're a specialty craft bean-to-bar chocolate maker, and those are not entirely synonymous, but I'm lumping all of those three attributes into one category. If what you're doing is you are focusing on the nerd market, so the people who care about cocoa content, the people who care about origin, the people who care about those things, and you're not paying attention to the aesthetic aspects of what you're doing, what you may be doing is reducing your appeal to a larger market. In the end, in order to be able to fulfill any of the sustainability claims that you might be making in your packaging, so we're sustainably sourced, whatever that means, you need to be sustainable as a business. Right? And in order to be sustainable as a business, you need to make sure that your marketing claims and your products are reaching a larger market. And this is where thinking about this is really important. Are you focusing on too narrow a market? And here's one example. If you only make 2-ingredient single origin chocolates, so you're focused on the nerdiest of the nerdiest section of the marketplace, right? You have immediately reduced the potential size of your market. And what you've also done is you've made it more difficult to differentiate among your competitors or between your competitors. Differentiate yourself from your competitors who are doing exactly the same thing. Right? It is, if you've got 47 people or 100 companies that are all doing 2-ingredient single origin from, all at 70 to 72%, right? And how do you differentiate what you're doing? What are you doing to make that 70% single origin Marignon different from what everybody else is doing in terms of 72% single origin Marignon? It's really, really challenging. Right? One way to do it that is suggested here is to focus on aesthetics and usability. So focus on the packaging, right? Focusing on, my packaging is really, really usable. I can get the bar out. I can put the bar back in. It may sound strange, but the company Dauphin, who put their inner wrappers inside what looked to be a tobacco pouch. I mean, talk about usability, amazing. It was really a usable package, and it was immediately recognizable, right? Which again, like what Askinosie is doing, it's immediately recognizable, right? Really, really important. Think about aesthetics. Think about usability, and then how do the aesthetics and the usability tie in with the nerdy aspects? Don't be nerdy just to be nerdy. Right, is the point here. Or if you're going to be nerdy, don't make everything you do nerdy, right? So you do want 20% of your product line to generate 80% of your revenue, right? And you want the cash cows, the products that are generating a lot of revenue, to be able to give you the freedom and to give you the resources so that you can do the really nerdy stuff. There's a really subtle balancing act you need to do here, which is, what are you known for, right? But I think that it is doable. For example, we look at Good Now Farms here in Massachusetts. I'm in Arizona. I don't know why I said here, but if you look at Good Now Farms, what they've done is they've got a bunch of award-winning single origin bars, but they've got all this stuff that just blows out of that mold. So their caramelized onion bar. I mean, which is caramelized onions to chocolate. Where would you go there? But why would you go there? Why would you think about that, caramelized onions in chocolate? It has a really, really interesting appeal, right? And it's not appealing to the nerd, right? The nerd would say, I want a 2-ingredient, 75% chocolate. I don't want cocoa butter. I don't want anything getting in the way, getting in between me and the cocoa beans. That's appealing to the nerd market, right? Doing all these other things, right, is talking about aesthetics, flavors, and aesthetic, right? Being able to develop a reputation for doing that sort of thing is really, really valuable, right? You have to have the chops. Whenever you get a great bag of beans in, you may want to say, okay, there's nothing between the beans and the potential consumer. Yes, but every bag of beans, is every bag of beans worth going really heavily nerdy on? I think the answer to that question is no. At least in my experience as a judge over the course of 20 years, I mean, I've eaten a lot of bad, well-produced, but not very palatable 2-ingredient chocolate. Right? So a real quick shout out to Elvia, who's, or I hope I pronounced that time, Elvia, who's connecting from Peru today. Elvia, I'm a big fan. I've been to Peru at least about a half a dozen times, mainly to Lima, Huánuco, Ucayali, and San Martin. That's where I spent most of the time. But I've also been in Peru, in Piura, right? Not only in the capital, but as far east as Chulucanas, up towards Amazonas. If you've never been to Peru, it's like some of the best food you'll find anywhere. It is modest, right? There's just amazing stuff. And it is the mix of cuisines from the Amazon and the Japanese and the Spanish. Just that fusion is just absolutely amazing. I've loved every single time I've visited there. So Elvia, thank you very much for connecting today and letting me know you're connecting from Peru. Yes, in Piura, where you find the white beans, the cacao Gran Blanco from Piura. And that was one of the reasons why I was in Piura. I was working to develop a distilled spirit. So a destilado de jugo de cacao. And we were originally looking at using the juice from cacao Gran Blanco in Chulucanas as the base for fermenting and then distilling. It was absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, there was not enough juice, and so it was incredibly expensive, and we ended up having to move into San Martin and north of Tocache, which might be Huánuco. It's been a while. I don't know the geography, and we needed to work with a variety that had a lot more juice. But I mean, absolutely amazing people, absolutely amazing landscape, and absolutely amazing cacao. So I really appreciated that trip to get to know. But again, the point here, we're getting back to this thing about Apple, is that if what you're going to do is you're going to focus your efforts on the nerdiest of the nerds, because exactly what you might want to do is you might want to focus on impressing the judges, right? So and judges in chocolate competitions are often the nerdiest of the nerds, getting into the details and all this other kind of stuff. What you are doing is you are limiting your market. Going back to the first one, right? Am I making single origin chocolate or chocolate that happens to be single origin, right? Am I making 2-ingredient chocolate or making chocolate that happens to be 2 ingredients? What is the order of the claim that you're making? Excuse me, really, really important to think that through. And how the claims are consistent, the order of the claims are consistent with who you're marketing to and who you're targeting to, right? Again, these are simple things to test. Although, creating 2 different versions of packaging is going to be a challenge. Creating 2 different web pages and then sending emails to people to drive them to web pages and to see how the conversion rates differ, that's an easy thing to do in most modern web systems. And I would encourage you to think about what my market is and how am I communicating to them with a claim and to the sort of purity test which is associated with it. I mean, which is one way to think about this, right? Again, thinking about the idea that you want 20% of your products to generate 80% of your revenue. If the only thing you're doing is 2 ingredients, 70%, if that's the only thing you're doing, unflavored, 2 ingredients, 70%, then you are in fact, you may be holding true to some internal standard that in fact isn't holding you back, right? You should be able to do that, right? But again, what I would do is I would suggest that what you do is if you're buying individual bags, right? Or everybody's buying individual bags, right? That what you do is if you're not mixing your bags, what you might, for consistency's sake, that what you might want to do is you might want to say, oh my gosh, this bag or this harvest or this origin is absolutely amazing, and only do the 2 ingredients 70% and round maybe, right? Which case you get 75% and it'll seem sweeter, right? Which is an interesting concept. Right? That's the way to think about, that's the way to take 2 of these ideas and think about how to implement into your product line. So quick shout out to Jin Kim, who's connecting from Southern California. Jin, thanks very much for connecting with us today. Yeah, Peruvian chaufa. I've had ceviche, freshwater ceviche, which has gotten me insanely sick. I did that at Terapoto. Oh my gosh, I had food poisoning, which lasted for like 2 weeks. But when I was up north in Chulucanas, like in this little restaurant in the backcountry, is just some of the most amazing freshwater ceviche in leche de tigre, which is the Peruvian style. Absolutely amazing. It's just, if you haven't been there, you could go just for the cuisine and never leave Lima, right? That's how amazing it is in the food there. And then there's some great chocolate makers, and if you make it into the countryside, don't immediately think that the place you should go is Cusco. I mean, it's an amazing place. Obviously Machu Picchu is an amazing place, but there is so much more to Peru than Machu Picchu. And I suggest you might want to go think about those things, and yeah, go for the food. All right. So next, what I want to do is I want to jump down to this next one, which is an interesting concept, which is if you have a problem, and if you have a problem with market perception, how are you going to go about addressing it? And again, I've often said, it's forget this idea of thinking outside the box, right? So in order to be creative, you have to think outside the box. What does that mean? Deepak Chopra says it's not enough to think outside the box. You need to throw the box away, right? Which is another way of thinking about this. And what this video with Rory is to me is it's not enough to throw the box away. You need to forget what boxes are. You need to go and start looking at your assumptions and how your assumptions are getting in the way of actually truly innovating. And one of the things that is pointed out in this is that who you ask to answer the questions is going to have an effect. So if you ask an engineer to answer this question, what you're going to get is you're going to get an answer which is rooted in engineering solutions. If you were to ask a social psychologist to answer this question, you're going to get a very different answer. If you ask somebody who spent 20 years in advertising, you're going to get a different answer. And so that's why I wanted to play this one for you. Who you ask for assistance, who you ask to give you answers for things is going to have an effect on the answers that you receive. And wrong answers or some answers could cost, in this particular case, billions of dollars. Now, as a small chocolate maker, that's not your budget, but you can get an idea about things that are expensive solutions to problems. And there are things that, oh my gosh, are just social engineering solutions to problems, which are going to be incredibly easy.
if you have a 6 billion budget to improve the Eurostar between London and Paris, yes, okay, 6 billion gets you high-speed railway tracks from St Pancras down to the coast. But are there other ways in which you could make Eurostar more desirable than flying? Because that's really your competition. And I merely said, well, you can put Wi-Fi on the trains, which they didn't do, for weirdly, for 12 years after they had spent £6 billion increasing the speed of the journey. Because it's not changing the quantity of time, it's changing the quality of time. And then, as in, if you really want to spend £1 billion of your budget, okay, you can employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the train handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'll have saved yourself £5 billion, and people will ask for the trains to be slowed down. Nobody boasts about how fast a cruise ship is, because it's an assumption of a cruise ship that the time spent on board is actually enjoyable.
So the audio is lower in this one. I don't have any way of increasing the audio, unfortunately. But the point here is really quite interesting in looking at a solution of how do you are we going to improve? Are we going to focus on quantity? Are we going to focus on, oh, let's make this trip shorter? And how much money is it going to cost to increase the infrastructure to make the trip shorter? So I'm going to cut it by 35 minutes from, on this part of the route, right? And it's going to cost $6 billion. Or what I could do is I could provide a relatively inexpensive upgrade, free Wi-Fi, good quality free Wi-Fi, so that people are doing the things that they would normally do when they're not on a train, but they're able to do them on a train, and there's no decrease in the satisfaction, the quality of the experience. I mean, Amtrak offers Wi-Fi here in the United States, but the Wi-Fi is usually so bad, right? So number one, it will come and go over the course of a journey. But if I've got 10 people hopping onto the same node as opposed to 50 people hopping on the same node, all of a sudden it's like the experience is so awful, I might as well not have Wi-Fi on the trains. Right? So how does this work for you? How does this work for you? Right? There are expensive solutions to the problems, which are engineering solutions, and there are comparatively inexpensive solutions, which are social engineering problems as opposed to physical engineering problems. And one thing you might say is, one analogy you might be able to look at is Starbucks. What did Starbucks do? Well, Starbucks did the fundamental insight that Starbucks had is, number one, is we're going to get the coffee out of a restaurant, out of a hotel. We're going to get it out of a some little trailer which is parked on the side of the road. What we're going to do is we're going to get a dedicated shop, right? So we're going to get a dedicated shop, and then we're going to talk to you about things like the origin of coffee and how different coffees are different. But then what they're going to say is that you can have your drink your way, right? And if you were to think about all the different versions of a drink that you can make at Starbucks, all the different orders of a call, decaf, half calf, full calf, skinny foam, this kind of foam, how many flavors, how many pumps of each flavor, iced, hot, all of those kinds of things. There's something like 40,000 variations, right? Now, perhaps 35,000 of them have never been ordered, right? But you get an idea of what the variety is, that by giving the consumer the perception that they're in charge, what you've done is you've turned the coffee shop, right? And now, almost everybody does this, but Starbucks is arguably the one who pioneered this, right? You've given people a perception of choice that they didn't have, and they're going to gravitate to you, right, to your place as opposed to somebody else. And this social engineering is had a focal point, which is training the barista, and training the barista, very, very quickly, who interacted with the customer and provided that experience to the customer, was able to completely transform the coffee experience. What Starbucks realized is they weren't selling coffee, they were selling lifestyle, right? And that's an important thing. It's harder to do with chocolate because of the kind of things you can do at the point of sale with chocolate are much more limited than the kind of things you can do at point of sale at coffee. I think that Knoop's in London is trying to address this because they have a bunch of different hot chocolates on their menu. I believe you can get them cold as well. And you can do some of the customization at Knoop's that you can do in a coffee shop, but you can do them with hot chocolate. Interesting kind of idea. But think about this. Are there ways that you can go and ask other people? Go and ask people who are not selling you equipment. Go and ask other people who have different backgrounds. And I think that might be part of my success. I have a high technology background, but I also have a fine arts background. I'm a writer, right? And so what I'm doing is I'm bringing this really diverse set of experiences to the answering the kinds of questions that people are asking me. And I don't see everything as a one size fits all kind of approach. And, while I would love for you to become a member and, hire me to answer your questions, I mean, just something as simple as talking to people who are in a completely different business from you and saying, how would you solve this problem, right? Don't necessarily take what it is that they're saying as true, but use it as input for the process. Here's another variable that I hadn't thought of. Here's another approach that I haven't thought of. I mean, if you go to a management consultant, you are always going to get a management consulting response. And the management consulting response is, you need to hire us to sell you a lot of really, really expensive services, right? And they tend to approach things in a particular kind of way, right? So in this particular case, they said, how do we make the trip better, whatever the word better is, on the Eurostar between St. Pancras and London to Calais? How do we do that better? And the engineer said, make the trip shorter, right? And the social engineer said, give people something to do and they won't care so much. Improve the quality of the food, right? Wouldn't cost $6 billion to improve the quality of food. Give them free Wi-Fi. What are some other things that you can do that will improve the perception, which are really cheap, right, to do on a per passenger mile basis, right? And see what that is. So when you apply this to the chocolate, right, you got to think about, again, go back to, who is my market? What are the claims? What are the language that I'm using? And then how am I going to communicate the changes, the differentiators that I have for my product? How are you going to communicate those to your customers? All of these things are connected in this loop, right? Whatever the answers you have, whatever the answers you come to, have to be communicated. And how you orient those claims, how you make the claims, is going to be something that is going to eventually determine the success of the changes that you've made. And in the particular case that we're talking about, having two claims and being able to A/B test them in your shopping cart, right? Being able to have two claims to be able to A/B test them in your social media, right, is well worth the investment to make happen. So just wanted to go that. This last one is not this last one, but another one is thinking about discounts.
If there was 20% off all BMWs, you wouldn't be that interested. Whereas if you had a mate who worked for a BMW dealership who could get you 20% off because you were a mate, you'd be bashing down a path to their door. The weirdest thing of all is this business of doing club card prices where you only get a discount if you use the loyalty program. Our argument, we suggested this to Sainsbury's, a discount that not everybody else can have has a higher perceived value than one that's just effectively open to all. If you say 50% off to over 30s or something, okay, the over 30s see that as being much more valuable than if you go X% off to everyone. The worst mistake you can make is assuming that once you're doing a discount, it doesn't need marketing because the discount stands for itself.
So what does this mean for you, right? So you could have a discount code. You could publish a discount code on the homepage of your website. You could put a discount code into an email and send it to everybody, right? But what is suggested here is that maybe the way to offer discounts is to say to some segment of your customers, listen, if we're going to give you the opportunity to refer us to your friends with this insider discount, and we're giving it to you, right? You're an insider, you're a customer, we love you. We can see from your purchase behavior that you buy a lot from us. we're going to thank you and say, pass it along to a friend. And so here's this interesting special insider discount code that only you can give, and you can give it to your friends. Right? This is the way to do discounting right. Not to say 40% off to everybody, but okay, how do you go about segmenting your list in order to be able to effectively communicate to your customers? And this is one of the reasons why I say it is probably worth the difference in price on a monthly basis. Have a shopping cart that enables you to do these kinds of things. You can segment your list. You can say, here are my 10 top highest return buyers, or here are the buyers, here are my customers that buy the most, even if they don't buy the most often. And then what I can do is I can send an email to them, and I'm going to send this email to them, and I'm going to give this special discount, not to them. Well, they could probably use it, but I'm encouraging them to pass it along. What is that doing? That kind of referral, that kind of word of mouth referral is priceless. It's worth more than the discount that you're giving. Right? So when you think about discounts, right, think about using them strategically, right, and not necessarily giving them up to everybody that you're going to give. And again, this goes all the way back to the first point that we're making about marketing and the order that you're making the claims. Right? You don't necessarily want to be the discount store where everything is discounted, right? And people walk in and they're expecting everything to be discounted. Right? So, Trader Joe's, for example, doesn't have sales. Prices are the prices. That's never discounted. Everybody's got the same thing. But if I go to a discount warehouse of one form or another, where they're constantly advertising what's on sale, what's on special this week, and everybody who walks in can take advantage of it, right? Then you are missing an understanding of how discounts can be used effectively. Sutherland makes here the point is strategically think about who your customers are, who your best customers are, and then incentivize them to be your best referral customers. Might be one of the most effective ways to use discounts. And again, A/B strategies. So you give to one part of your list, oh, here's 10% off, or the other part of your list, well, it's normally $50 minimum free shipping, but for you, free shipping if you order within X amount of time. Right? There are lots of ways to test what is going to be the most effective offer and what is going to return the most. And then even if you're discounting it, what is the ROI on all these things? So think about discounts. Think about how you communicate the discounts. You want to be a great chocolate maker that sometimes offers discounts, but not the low price chocolate maker, right? Not the one that's discounting all the time, right? If you are, you're attracting very, very different sets of customers. Somebody who's coming in and looking only at the prices or the prices first may not be the customer for you as a specialty chocolate maker. Right? The last one I think is also really important here, and we're going to talk about McDonald's.
McDonald's. Every single other competing restaurant at the time, where they would have gone out and researched people, what do you want from a diner? They would have said really high quality food and a massive range of choice. McDonald's spotted two extraordinary things about food. People particularly like food when it's very consistent, because an evolutionary instinct has said, you've eaten something that tastes like this before, you're still alive, therefore it's safe to eat again. Ray Kroc of McDonald's said people don't want the best burger in the world, they want a burger that tastes just like the one they had last time. That's why anybody who's worked in McDonald's will know you toast the bun for a precise number of seconds. Starbucks, probably their psychological insight was you can't charge $2.50 for a coffee if you're a cafe, but if you call yourself a coffee shop, you can. If somebody only does one thing, we tend to assume they're much better at it than someone who does lots of things and will pay correspondingly.
So this is an interesting point, but I want to focus on one aspect of it particularly. And the one aspect that I want to focus particularly is that cocoa beans are a seasonal product, right? So, the cocoa beans will change from harvest to harvest. They'll change from one part of a producing country to another part of a producing country. And one of the great things about being a craft specialty chocolate maker is that every new batch of beans represents an opportunity for new creative expression. But that is at odds with many customers. So why do people go and buy Hershey's, right? Well, number one is it's what they grew up on. It's what they had as a child. And their memory of the flavor today is their memory of the flavor when they were a child. And it may not be Hershey's, it could be Cadbury Dairy Milk. It could be anything, right? But a lot of people crave that consistency. And you as a chocolate maker should be able to be consistent, right? The goal is if I get different beans, I am a master of the craft of chocolate making so that I can blend, I can change my roast, I can play with the recipe at any given time to make sure that the chocolate that I'm creating from these beans this year tastes like the chocolate I was creating from those beans last year. And there is a large segment of the market that this is what they crave. They want that level of consistency, right? You don't have to do it for everything. Again, if there's a 20% of your product generates 80% of your profits, what you may want to do is you want to say, for that 20% of my products, I want to make sure they're, dead nuts, consistent every single batch, every single time. And maybe you're thinking, well, I can do that with caramel. I can do it with that with nut paste. I can do that with other things, but I don't need to worry about that as a chocolate. The answer is no, right? If you're making a solid chocolate bar, focus on getting the skills necessary, developing the skills necessary to be able to repeat a flavor profile over and over and over again, even if the underlying beans change slightly. Now, this is one of the reasons why big chocolate makers blend, right? They'll blend roast. So if you're getting 5 bags of beans in, blend the bags of beans together. If you're doing multiple roasts, right, after winnowing, mix the roast together. If you're getting, 20, putting in 5 different melangers, mix the melangers together. Every single time you blend, right, you give yourself an opportunity to be more consistent. Blending can be your friend. You can do that in single origin 70% chocolates, right? Or you can say, I am going to get beans from 2 or 3 origins, right? And I can change the ratio of one bean to another bean. I can start off with a bulk bean and add some flavor from another origin, other producing country. All these are ways to be consistent. There is a large selection of your customers. There's a large cross-section of your customer base, which is going to want that level of consistency. Now, again, you get, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing bag of beans. I'm going to make a single origin 2 ingredient where I'm just highlighting the beans. And maybe that's what you generate your reputation with. That's what you enter into one awards program. And maybe you can think strategically, oh my gosh, this awards program rewards different things. So I might put this in the International Chocolate Awards, but I might put this in the Good Food Awards. That would be an interesting kind of way to think about how to do things. So it's really, really important to understand McDonald's business, right? Is why do people from Kansas City go to McDonald's in Paris, right? Because number one, they're afraid of getting sick. And number two, they want a taste of home, right? Why are people buying, industrial chocolate? Because people know that the product that I bought last week is going to taste like the product that I buy next week. That's one of the primary motivators for people, right? So think about that, right? And in what you're doing, right? I can often tell it is a tell, right? If a chocolate maker says every batch is different because every batch is different because every batch is different, right? Right. I would think that part of the way to prove that you are an actual craft chocolate maker who understands the technical elements of making chocolate, irrespective of the kind of beans that you're using. Are you using specialty beans or commodity beans? That doesn't matter, right? But your ability to take the beans and irrespective of the method that you're using to make the chocolate, from batch to batch to batch, you can be consistent if your customer asks you to be consistent. And that's what I think we can learn from this example about from McDonald's. So this is Elvia again from Peru. To educate about origin cacao, some brands even use the harvest year. That's true, right? Some do. But as a differentiator, what does that mean? Right? So, for example, champagne tends not to be vintaged because most champagne is blended. I mean, it really needs to be a special year for it to be a vintage champagne. In wine, we look at the vintage so that we know that in 1976 is different from 1977, from 1978. And because we understand, because that's the way the industry is set up, they value at the upper tiers of the marketplace, they value that differentiation. Why? Right? Because if you get a difference between the 76 and the 77, and a wine critic gives you a really high score for one of those 2 years, people are going to start paying a lot more for your wine, right? And it sounds crass to put it that way, but that is one of the reasons why there's vintaging, right? For people to be able to differentiate, this is a good year, this is a bad year. And good years are worth more than bad years. I'm willing to pay more for them. Anyway, they may or may not be worth more. That's a different question. Right? In chocolate, it is only until relatively recently that people have been starting to vintage their chocolate. And you can vintage, and people tend to vintage by the harvest of year, right? And maybe the season. So you got the off harvest, the wet harvest, the dry harvest, or the peak harvest and the off peak harvest. Those are ways to do. Those are ways to differentiate those, right? And it has nothing to do with the origin. I could just say I'm blending beans from, I'm blending beans from Cameroon, Nigeria, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. They're all within the same belt, right? So it's a West African blend, and I'm using the off-peak harvest or the peak harvest, right? I can say it's a blend, but I can say that's a blend within the same season, right? So there are ways to go about doing it, but the real question is, why do you do it, right? And the reason why you're doing it is you can differentiate a product, right? And hopefully by differentiating it, you're differentiating in a way that will increase consumer perception of value. Basically, it may cost the same to make, but you're going to be able to charge 10% more or 20% more or 30% more, right? One of the challenges with chocolate is it has a tendency not to increase in value as it ages. Wine does that. Some cheeses do that. Some beers do that. Some olive oils do that. I don't necessarily know that olive oils do that. I'll take that back. I was thinking about balsamic vinegars. So, there is a 75-year-old AIB certified balsamic. And the last time I looked, those things before tariffs, and the last time I probably bought a bottle was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I'd be willing to pay somewhere between $150 and $200 for a 100 ml bottle. I was spending over $2,000 a liter on vinegar, right? And there was a reason. It was amazing, right? And it's so much different from the quote unquote balsamic vinegar you could get at your big box store, right? So again, LVI, I think this is a really, really great idea, right, to do it. But there needs to be something more than just, oh, this is 2025 and this is 2026, right, to do this, right? If chocolate appreciated in value, if I could take the chocolate, set it aside, right? You can do this. You can take the chocolate, set it aside, but in block form, and make sure the blocks are uniform and they're all stored exactly the same way. What you do is you'd melt it down and retemper it, right? And then what you could do is you could say, oh my gosh, here's the difference between the 2020 and here's the difference between the 2024, and it might be amazing, right? There's some ways that you could play with the market that way. You might be able to do the chocolate equivalent barrel futures. If you found a really, 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 really good bag of beans, you might be able to play with it that way. So there are ways to go about doing this. But, is this a 2025 harvest chocolate, or is it chocolate from the 2025 harvest? You do need to think about the way you order the claims. It's great chocolate, right, that happens to be from this harvest. It's a great chocolate that happens to be from some other harvest, rather than saying vintage 2025 or vintage 2024 as the lead. So going back to the original claim, really, really important to consider those things. So that's all we have time for today. We're past the hour. I am talking, there is this thing about connecting the dots. Why am I doing this, right? So number one, think psychology first, media second. So don't think, well, should we do TikTok or Instagram? Start with a human decision. What makes somebody pick up a bar, right? And then what you're going to do is you're going to say, oh, how are we going to advertise that? And then use attention as a lever. You can't directly command feelings, but you can direct attention, right? I'm looking at this and I need to make some, I'm gonna fix this up. I think this, if you make food round, will it taste sweeter? It's in there twice. But then I also included this, if you want to learn more about who Rory Sutherland is, you can go and watch this video on YouTube. And then this is just a fun one. Successful businesses contain an element of absurdity, which is another just fun thing to think about. Right. Is Rory the be-all and end-all of marketing? Guys, I don't know that he is. But what I do love is that even when I disagree with what he has to tell me about chocolate, I'm almost always intrigued, and I almost always spend time thinking about what it is that he has to say. And with that, we're at the end of today's episode of PodSafe Chocolate. The title for today's episode was, Are You Marketing Chocolate the Wrong Way? Right? And I hope I've made a case through these videos, which you can play over and over again and listen to the video here, to get some idea about how you might implement some of these ideas to change your thinking. Right? And with that, in closing, right, what I will have to say is that this episode of PodSafe Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by the members of The Chocolate Life. This is the homepage right now. You can go click on the green button. I'm signed into my account, but if you're not, it will say join, and you can become a member. There's always a free membership tier, but if you do have the resources, I would appreciate becoming a premium member, and there are a bunch of benefits for premium members. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, push all the buttons, do all the things. That will be appreciated in order to be able to grow the channel. And as I head out today, I do want to remind everybody, as I do at the end of every episode of PodSafe Chocolate, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody, ciao.